serves on the Evelyn Clark Chair as Professor of History, and is currently the Chair of the History Department. It's a complicated sentence at Vassar College. A specialist on gender and religion in the Enlightenment era, her service to the profession is also noteworthy, and what I'd like to highlight right now, especially her role as chair of the H-Grants Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. Her most recent single-authored book is The Wanton Jesuit and Wayward Saint, A Tale of Sex, Religion, and Politics in 18th-Century France.
So, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I know at the end of the day, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me. I have to say, part of me is just, I'm going to go in a very different direction, but I see myself as a bridge between the discussion on academic masculinities and this discussion. So I'm going to take that discussion of the production of knowledge, but look at it from the perspective of what we do. And in terms of where that's coming from, it's coming from my own current project, which is on sexual assault in the Catholic Church in the 17th and 18th century, which has led me to ask the question, in fact, this is the title of my paper, which is whose voices mattered and don't. And because this is the central question that I found myself asking. And again, reflecting how archives are places of power in terms of the silences they create, in terms of the violences. And I've been deeply influenced by Black feminist scholarship. I've also been influenced by the summer of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've had the honor of doing some anti-racist work here within French history, but also at the Corporation of Haverford College. And what I've really come to realize, and what I've been trying to do with my own scholarship, and actually what I'm presenting to is what we need to do as a profession, is the necessity of bringing accountability and self-reflection to think about hierarchies and positionality. And so I guess I'm going to offer a bit of a trigger warning here, because, and Ian, you said beautifully, real learning is about unease. So I might be just doing that. And I also want to say I do have respect, even though I'm going to go into for practitioners of the Enlightenment, but I think knowing the kind of work you're doing, you understand where I'm coming from. The point of inspiration for me was reading Emily Callaghan's On Acknowledgements, a short piece in the AHR that came out in February 2020. And I think acknowledgements really show us how it really takes a village to write a book. There's no question about that. But I loved how she said something, and I'm going to quote it just for nothing else but humor, is that, a real acknowledgement could say the following: Dear reader, I exploited my wife's reproductive labor, neglected my children and aging parents, shifted departmental service onto my colleagues, extracted knowledge from people in a distant country, contributed to the warming of the planet by flying all over the world, and withdrew from my community, all in order to bring you this book. I love that it's very funny and whatever, and it's probably the right time of the afternoon to bring that. But it really, in some ways, is what it encapsulates is the ideal scholar, right? The scholar with no restraints, with means, and can really put their responsibilities behind them. They can travel, and that they put their scholarship first consistently and with impunity. And I ask, how many of us judge ourselves based on this ideal model, and how many of us are constantly feeling like we fall short when we have this model? So acknowledgements, as Callaghan points out, reveal a variety of hierarchies and of privilege. And I want to start with that, which is institutional, okay? Part of what we see in those acknowledgements are the many things, the grants, the leaves, and who's behind that. And it tells us about, the ability to get those grants is about the author's competence and credibility and their privilege. The privilege to travel unchecked, not to worry about visas. My own experience after 9/11 was my heart would race every time I re-entered the country and had to talk to immigration about the questions they would ask me. So that that ability to just cross borders is not open to everybody. And so what I was thinking in terms of this specific panel was about teaching the 18th century, specifically teaching the Enlightenment. And I am very privileged because I teach at an exclusive liberal arts college where I can really teach anything, and where I teach students who are engaged and who live in this world of privilege. But let me tell you, teaching the Enlightenment has been an ongoing struggle. And sometimes I think it's positionality. I think my students implicitly question my ability to teach the Enlightenment because of who I am. I did a lifelong Vassar course for older students, and I had this guy just really give me a lecture on the Enlightenment. And I did not say anything directly, but after that I said, never again. I'm not wasting my time with that kind of thing. So, and I've done all kinds of things. And one of the things, and I've talked to other people who've done this, what do you do in this instance? And there's been all these, if you look at syllabi, all this fabulous repackaging of how you teach the Enlightenment, you know, with a lot with sex in the title, that always helps. And so, you know, because we are dealing with the reality of low enrollments. I mean, this is something that history is dealing with, and that's a very real thing in terms of what we do. At the same time as, you know, we can kind of roll our eyes and, you know, grumpus about our students making us do this. I have to say, I also respect that their social activism and their sense of a kind of social justice sometimes forces us to think about the Enlightenment with a different lens. In other words, it helps us towards a kind of act of decolonizing. And really to help us think about that, and the work that you all are doing is that the Enlightenment is not just the march of great men and great works. And then there's this question of accessibility and digitizing. But you know, when you think about the production of knowledge, again, I have to ask, does accessibility necessarily mean inclusivity? Because at the end of the day, that digitizing is still a curating of the production of knowledge. And the question remains is how do we overcome that? You know, and I think the first thing is recognizing that. Just saying that something is an open access isn't enough. To return to Kalki, you know, what she says at the end is a critical reading of acknowledgments suggests to me a different root cause of our marginalization, the structural incentives to reproduce versions of ourselves rather than to become more inclusive. And so I bring this quote into my concerns in a broad sense of what's happened in Enlightenment studies. I do think that at the end of the day, what we have is a situation where there's institutional privileges. How many institutions can really afford to hire specialists in who are Enlightenment scholars? Not even liberal arts colleges, by no means. And that could be a problem because often my kind of institution is where graduate students are made. And so if this is happening, that really says something. And then you have this question is graduate programs who can afford to do this produce future scholars who then who are in a very vulnerable position in the end, because in order to succeed in graduate programs, they need to reproduce that hierarchy. They need to acknowledge that hierarchy and to show that they belong, that they have a right to be there. But then they don't get a job. And I think it's a great thing. At least in my institutions, the days of saying that you went to Princeton, Yale, Columbia, it's not enough. We have equity advisors who sit in our hiring and really kind of call people out for saying, you know, just because they went to X institution doesn't mean you either dismiss them or immediately assume brilliance, right? But how many institutions are doing what they're doing at Vassar? And again, I feel my privilege in this. And this is key because what's embedded in all of this too is that kind of association with elite institution, that membership, that club you belong to, is about grants and fellowships and access to publishing. You know, I have to ask is how many book proposals coming from a scholar who is belonging to one of these institutions gets a much closer glance than somebody coming from an institution, and even a liberal arts institution, you know, coming from a less prestigious institution. And that has intellectual implications because for me, it's about an echo chamber. It's an echo chamber, so if you go beyond the acknowledgments and you look into footnotes, you start to see the canonization, that echo of the same conversations, the same people of thought. I mean, do you ask, where are the women? Where are the people of color? And in saying this is not just the politics about grievance, but ultimately it's about thinking of new methodologies and new perspectives. It's about intellectual openness. And so right away I can imagine some people are thinking, well, isn't she a little biased? Isn't she a little skeptic? Where's the skepticism coming from? But I throw back that question and say, why is it that some people are asked those questions, aren't you being biased, aren't you being skeptical, but others are not, they're objective. And it's so interesting to me because you were talking about it in your panel, Christy, as the white male professor as the embodiment of objectivity, but it's a disembodied embodied because objectivity is not embodied, and all others are constantly embodied so that they cannot escape those bodies, right? And that goes into the production of knowledge as recognition. And this is not policing, but a challenge as to whose work and what methodology is canonical. I reject the idea that you do a paragraph or a chapter on gender and race, that's it, that's done. It's 2022, people. Let's just kind of move past that. Again, so that we don't repeat ourselves. And this is the act of self-reflection and accountability. Does it matter? I will end really quickly. I'm working with the academic intern as chair, who is from immigrant family from Jamaica. And she said to me just this week, you don't know how much it means to me to be working with a woman of color as a woman of color. And I'm the first woman in the history department as a woman of color to have gotten tenure, let alone to have been the department chair. And it makes a difference. Thank you.